Have you ever dreamt of seeing the world? Of finally stepping out of that boring, mundane life you live and visiting those countries you've been dreaming about seeing since you were a child? To dine on foreign foods, to experience majestic cities, and to see breathtaking sights of nature. I want you to imagine yourself visiting that one place you've always wanted to. The Eiffel Tower, the Grand Canyon, the Great Barrier Reef, whatever. Imagine that you're standing there. What do you feel? How do you think it's gonna be? What if you're standing there and instead of being on top of the world, you feel empty? What do you do when you finally visit those places you've been wanting to see for so long, but nothing changes? When your brain is telling you that you're living the dream, but your heart says nothing. Do you give up? Do you decide to settle down, think that traveling just isn't it for you anymore? Or do you keep going? Do you keep traveling? Do you keep thinking, oh, the next country, the next city, the next place I go, that's when it'll click. That's when I'll finally feel a change. That's when I'll finally feel alive. Okay, that may have been slightly overdramatic, but honestly, it does encapsulate how I felt after a semester studying abroad. Moving to Europe had been my dream for a long time. My parents lived there when I was a baby, so they told me all these great stories, and I really wanted to go back. Here we are though, 2 years later, and I still don't have an answer to a lot of those questions. Don't get me wrong, I recognize what an awesome privilege it was to study abroad, and I did my best to take advantage of that. What I want to do is explore all the facets of moving somewhere new and what that life is like. And this video is the second in a series of me trying to cover that topic through my own personal life experiences. It's meant to be a presentation of life and to encourage you both to try moving somewhere new and exploring, also appreciating what you have right where you are. And don't worry, it's not going to be another video about homesickness or loneliness. Those aren't really things that I dealt with at all, and it's kind of hard to feel homesick if you don't necessarily feel like you have a home. Even before leaving for France, the excitement was palpable. The group chats were made and we already planned out the first 2 weekends. When we arrived though, we wanted to explore our home base, which was Metz, France. To be honest, there wasn't a whole lot to see there, at least for what we wanted to see. I mean, when you first get to Europe, you think of visiting Germany or Italy or Paris or Spain, and you don't really care about some small French town. Besides, we had like 4 months to see it, so we weren't gonna miss anything. The one really cool thing to check out was a graveyard that we walked past pretty much any time we went to the train station. From the outside at least, the graves look really old and cool, and I personally always enjoy walking through graveyards, so I definitely added that to the list of things to do. But anyways, that's enough about Metz. Within a week of arrival, 15 of us were off to Brussels for the weekend. Pommes frites, Belgian waffles, all the good stuff. For a couple of us though, it was an especially exciting trip because we were going to the Formula One race in Spa. Potentially the most beautiful circuit in the world and known for its incredible racing. It was my first time at a Formula One event and I was incredibly excited. This has been my birthday present to myself and I've been hyping it up for a long time. Formula One is a pretty dynamic sport. Every race is a little bit different, but if there's one thing you can count on at Spa, it's going to be exciting racing.
Well, there are many things this afternoon that we have never seen before. As we red flag the race, it is time to go back to the pit lane again because conditions haven't improved. Ladies and gentlemen, the race will not resume.
Yep. That's right. The one thing that never happens to a Formula One race happened. It got canceled, and we did not see a dime of our money returned. It certainly wasn't the end of the world, but it definitely put a damper on my spirits to start off our semester. However, our disappointing venture couldn't dampen our spirits for too long, because in 3 days' time we were on an overnight train to the French Riviera. 3 full days of soaking up the Mediterranean sun and swimming in the sea. We were drinking the local wine in Nice and promenading through the streets of Monte Carlo, hatching schemes about how to sneak on our way onto the nearest mega yacht. On our last day, we were joined by some local teenagers at a cliff jumping spot and plunged into the brilliant azure sea. I remember treading water after my last jump, looking over at Nice in the distance, thinking to myself, this is it. This is the dream. That is what it's all about. Of course, it couldn't last. Later that day, we headed back to Metz for another week of classes. It wasn't long though before we were gone again, this time to Amsterdam. Unfortunately, I was suffering from crippling tonsillitis, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. The weather wasn't great, but the canals were nevertheless scenic, and we spent plenty of time wandering around the streets and local markets. None of us were particularly interested in the local herbs, so to speak, so it wasn't an especially interesting trip. Before we knew it, we were back home in Berlin. That's right. We went to Berlin next. We took an overnight train only 4 days after getting back from Amsterdam. This was my first time in Germany, and as someone who had studied the language for 4 years, I was quite excited. Berlin was great. Easy public transit and plenty to see in the museums and around the streets. Great kebabs, and also, Munich. 4 days after returning from Berlin, we were back in Germany. I was born just south of Munich and had been wanting to visit ever since I was a child, so this trip was going to be special. Beer, pretzels, perfect weather, a day trip to Salzburg. This was finally a city I could really spend some time in. Just to sink my teeth in, Switzerland, okay. Our next trip was another 4 days later, probably the most beautiful place I've ever been to. Incredible hikes, expensive food, awesome scenery. What I wouldn't give to just spend a month in a chalet in the Alps and just Santorini. This was my brainchild. I planned the whole trip, left after another 4 days at home, and flew out of Milan. Great food, awesome swimming, cliff jumping, perfect relaxing, romantic ambiance. Perfect for, that's right. Next was Freiburg. Solo trip this time. Met with some locals at a scenic overlook and spent the night eating and partying it up with them. Really cool opportunity to finally meet the local people and connect and start to, Luxembourg, right. Luxembourg was next, just a short little day trip this time. Great hot chocolate, lots of walking, neat little, finally, Italy. The trip I'd been waiting for my whole life. Cinque Terre was cool, really great food, and neat to see all of the cities. Pompeii was awesome and somewhat somber. Obviously not a fun place to visit, but we were there on Halloween, so it was somewhat thematic. Amalfi Coast, wow. Breathtaking views by the water. Fortunately, it was a little bit cold and we got rained out one day, so we didn't have the whole complete experience. Then at last, we were in Rome and the clouds broke. An almost mythical monument that I'd heard about in stories and movies was about to be before me, and I was nervous with anticipation. I vividly remember rounding the corner and laying my eyes on it for the first time. The Colosseum. My brain was telling me that this was the moment, this was it. This was the awesome thing you've been waiting to see. My brain was saying that this is everything I've been wanting to see for years, but my heart was saying nothing. It's not like it didn't live up to the expectations. I knew there were going to be cars and people and scaffolding. It was exactly like I'd imagined it and more so. I didn't feel disappointed, I just didn't really feel anything. That was about as much as I was able to process in the moment, because we still had a whole day of exploring to do. After some incredible lasagna only a few blocks away, we wandered around the streets for the rest of the day. The next morning, by 11, we were on the train to Florence, which actually ended up being my favorite city in Italy, and maybe in all of Europe. We went on a wine tour in the Tuscan countryside that was genuinely phenomenal, in part because almost our entire group was together for the first time in a while. We visited 2 vineyards, neither of which were light on the poor, so everyone ended up being in a great mood. This revived my spirits a little bit after the strange lack of feelings in Rome, and carried somewhat throughout the rest of our Italy trip. We explored Florence, I took a day trip to Siena, and we closed out with a final day in Venice. Italy wasn't the end of our trip, however, we still had a couple weekends left. 3 days after getting back, I was on a train again, this time overnight to Bratislava, Slovakia. I was only in Bratislava for a couple hours before taking a train to Budapest to meet up with the rest of the group for the remainder of the weekend there. The architecture was really cool, a lot of walking around, thermal spas were nice, and the food might be my favorite in all of Europe. But I realized something at the end of it. The Budapest felt like a sort of microcosm of our trip as a whole. Every weekend was starting to blend together. When every trip can be described with the same 3 words, walking, looking, eating, they begin to feel shallow. We never had time to dissect or talk about the trip. It was never, what did you think of this city? What did you think of this country? What did you think about the culture? What did you think about the people? Would you want to go back? Would you want to live there? We did have one trip left as a big group though, and that was to Chamonix, France over Thanksgiving break. There was no expectations besides cooking the best Thanksgiving meal possible. Honestly, it was a blast. It was just an awesome time surrounded by the people that I'd grown really close to throughout the last couple months. After that, the last week or two was just a blur. I had a couple day trips to Colmar, France, and Strasbourg and Paris. Yes, I spent an entire 4 months in France and only 1 day in Paris, and I don't want to talk about it.
As I was on that flight home, I realized something. In the 4 months that I had spent in Metz, France, not once did I ever actually visit that graveyard. I didn't really spend time there at all. I lived somewhere for 4 months and I didn't have a favorite restaurant. I didn't have a local spot that I'd like to go to. I could have spent time at a museum. I could have spent time at a local cafe or bakery. I could have tried to learn the language and met some local people, but instead I opted to just go see the rest of the country, which was fun, don't get me wrong, but I could have had the opportunity for a deep, albeit narrow experience. Instead, I opted for the wide but shallow experience, trying to see as much of the continent as possible. I think I'm just burnt out. Not of travel in general, but of this short weekend trip style. As much as I want to see Norway or Australia or Chile or all these different places, I have no desire to go there for like 3 days or for a week. That just, to me, would be a waste of time. What I would prefer is the ability to have some kind of solo travel experience where you can live somewhere for a month or 2 or 3, get to stay in the area and around that area, get to learn the language, get to meet the people, get to build some kind of community. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you shouldn't do these shorter, faster travel experiences, because honestly, that's most of what people can do, myself included. We have school, we have jobs, we have responsibilities, family. Just go live somewhere across the world for 3 months. And also, I definitely appreciate the fact that this faster travel allowed me to see a lot more than I would have otherwise. Because I was traveling every weekend, I got to see most of Europe, I got to see most of what I wanted to see, and if I'd spent, a month or 2 months or 3 months in each of those locations, it would have taken me 2 years to see the same stuff that I saw. Maybe I'll never have that opportunity to slow travel and live somewhere. I recognize that is difficult to achieve, and it's definitely a privilege, and it's not something many people get to do, but that doesn't mean I can't try. I think another thing I learned from my time in Chamonix there at the end was the value of a serious, close group of friends. And part of the reason that experience was as good as it was because this was people that I had been traveling with and spending my life with for the last 4 months. Look, the idea of traveling somewhere new and just meeting friends for a night, going out, whatever, is fun. Don't get me wrong, I've done that. It is a good time, but
I don't know, there's something about traveling with your friends that just builds a bond and a connection that you just don't get elsewhere, and I wish I'd taken advantage of it sooner. The next semester after Europe, I was back on campus in Atlanta, but my travels were far from over. In March, I received a co-op offer at a company in Connecticut, which meant that I would work there in the summer of 2022 as well as the spring of 2023. I was moving again to somewhere completely new. This time though, things were going to be different. I was going to live there twice as long, and I had a specific goal in mind. Focus on something that I had ignored in both Idaho and Europe: my community.